Welcome everyone to the next series in our colloquium this spring. I am so very excited to welcome our next guest, Dr. Zoe Todd. And Dr. Todd is someone I followed on Twitter and followed their work over the years, and was really excited when they accepted our invitation to come speak. So I'm not going to give too much of an introduction, simply because we're running over time and because Dr. Todd has much to say. But for those of you all who don't know and haven't read the flyer, Dr. Zoe Todd is a Red River Métis artist, scholar, and advocate working in the intersectional Freshwater Fish Futures team in restoring human-fish relations across Indigenous homelands. They are currently Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. So without further ado, Dr. Todd.
Tansy, thank you, Dr. Hall. It's really an honor to join you all today, and it's always delightful to get to talk about fish. So I'm going to share with you some sort of perspectives from the amazing team that I work with. And we're situated in Canada, the US, Australia, and Borneo at the moment. And we have, people interested in joining us all the time. So our team is expanding. So I'm gonna share my screen here. And I keep thinking about that hilarious TikTok of the person pretending to be a professor trying to share their screen. And I do it every time I go to teach. I'm like, where is it again? Okay. And so it's good. It's good to stay humble and know that you have limited sort of power. So I'll just start there. So Tansay nito temtak, so initsigasuun, niya odapem suesqueo, egwamaga, snanaa, squalacum, niwigan, gananaskomi tinawao, marsi kakyao, niwakomakinak. So I'm so delighted to be here today. As Dr. Hall said, I'm a Métis, Red River Métis scholar, currently working at Carleton University. I am from Edmonton, or Mesquici-Waskahigan, which is a city in Alberta. If you could just put in the chat function what you know about Alberta, that it would be interesting for me when I speak to audiences outside of my home provinces. It's always interesting. Most people, what they know of Alberta is oil, and that's okay. That's a fair thing to know about us. Alberta is a western province in Canada with a significant amount of oil and gas deposits throughout its the territory it claims. And we are the #1 producer of oil in Canada. And Canada is actually the US's #1 foreign supplier of oil. So you have significant amounts of oil. You're very good at your domestic production of oil in the US. But Canada also sends a lot of our oil production south to the US. So that ties the watersheds that I've grown up in intimately with both the economies of Canada, but also the US. And this matters precisely because oil and gas activity throughout Alberta has significant impacts on fish. So today we're going to talk about freshwater fish futures, strategies for learning from fish in uncertain times. And I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about the work that my team and I are doing on protecting freshwater fish through some sort of like innovative strategies that we're employing in our own work. So thank you for being here with us. The bull trout, I've included it as sort of our first slide here because I work on a current project with Janelle Baker, who is a Métis ethnobotanist at Athabasca University in Alberta. And we're also working with Lorelei Hansen, who is an environmental scholar at Athabasca University. At Carleton, I'm working with my wonderful research colleague and research partner, Dr. Zoe Todd. And we're also working with Bill Snow, who's the consultation manager for the Stoney Nakoda Nations in Southwest Alberta. So through this project, which is funded with the New Frontiers in Research Fund, which is a new fund that has been developed in Canada that explicitly tries to fund interdisciplinary work or transdisciplinary work. We've been working to sort of address some of the challenges in Alberta around protecting freshwater fish habitats through an interdisciplinary approach. So for us, that involves bringing in art and science and Indigenous knowledge, as well as landscape architecture. We're also implementing some augmented and virtual reality components. And so we're kind of trying to address a series of questions that have been asked of us over the last few decades in our community commitments, in our academic commitments, which is, how do we get people to really care about freshwater fish in places that don't think of themselves as fish places? So in my work in Canada, I argue that every part of Canada is a fish place. And every Indigenous nation across the country has the relationship to fish and have stories and laws that are entangled with fish. And, there's a lot of, there's sort of like a colonial public understanding that marine parts of the country, so the coastal regions, have fish relations. There's an understanding that the Great Lakes have a fishy kind of heritage. But it's been a little bit harder to sort of make the case that places like the prairies are fish places, even though they're full of fish. And so Lauren Fitch, who is a retired fisheries biologist that we've drawn a lot of inspiration from, and is, has been really important to the project. He wrote a paper in 2015 looking at basically the collapse of fish populations throughout almost every watershed in Alberta. And he made sort of the bold assertion based on the data that he's working with, that it isn't, the sort of the received wisdom over time has been that the problem with fish conservation is that people overfish. And it really places an individual responsibility on anglers, recreational fishermen, but also on Indigenous communities that fish as well, who have been criminalized for their fishing. There's been a lot of sort of discourse in Alberta that this is an individualized problem about people over harvesting, not respecting quotas. But he flips the script by looking at the data that's available and says that no, this is a habitat destruction problem. Alberta, as the #1 supplier of oil in Canada and entangled in these international markets, has a fish problem, but the problem isn't anglers. The problem isn't recreational fishing. And it certainly isn't Indigenous fishermen, but it's that through agricultural development, municipal development, even just all sorts of different impacts, that habitat destruction is the real cause of the fish decline. And so our project is aiming to really respond to that challenge by encouraging people who might live in parts of the province that they may not get to interact with fish on a day-to-day basis, but we want them to really understand that nonetheless they have relationships to fish, because every single person in Alberta lives in a watershed. And so this is sort of where this project gets its origins from. It's also deeply inspired by my late stepfather, Wayne Roberts, who was a zoologist and a curator at the Museum of Zoology at the University of Alberta, who was really passionate about fish and reptiles and amphibians throughout the province. And in his lifetime, he was one of the people that was working in the 80s, in the late 70s, early 80s, in the mountainous regions where bull trout used to be really, really plentiful. And he noticed, that they were declining. And so he was one of the people that raised the early alarm about the decline of the bull trout. So this project is also deeply inspired by him. And if he were still with us today, he would be our scientific advisor on the project, but he sadly passed away in 2018. The kind of incredible thing is that within a year of his passing, we secured this grant and are able to sort of continue his legacy in that way. So part of the project too is that we're doing these in-depth podcast interviews with retired scientists and current scientists and other community actors who are doing work on what they call native trout. So bull trout, west slope cutthroat trout, and other trout species that are under threat. And really trying to find out sort of, how these different parts of the community have been working to try and address sort of the fish population declines throughout different watersheds in the province. And what's kind of really interesting that's emerging from this work, we're also working closely with knowledge keepers and elders from the Stoney Nakoda Nations. And what's really emerging from this project is a realization that so many people are invested in the trout and their protection. They're so deeply valued. And we'll come to some sort of examples of that in a bit. But the capacity to communicate across different elements of community have hindered the ability of different parts of these communities in Alberta to really come together. And so talking to scientists, like they've been working for decades on bull trout, but they haven't necessarily been talking to Indigenous community members outside of some pretty like pro forma rigid federal and provincial regulatory bodies, but just, encouraging people to just sit down and tell stories is one way that we're trying to really help folks really think differently about their responsibilities to fish. So I'll go to the next slide. So we're calling this a fish restoring method, and that's at the heart of everything that we do. So drawing on the work of Kutcha Risling-Baldy, who's an amazing Indigenous scholar at Humboldt State University in California. She does amazing work. I think that today they're having a fundraiser, like a telethon for their food sovereignty lab. So if you have an opportunity after this to go check that out, that would be really awesome because they do really, really good work over there. So drawing on Kutcha Risling-Baldy's concepts of renaming and reclaiming Coyote first person, we sort of draw on this to help inform our concept of fish restoring. So restoring in the way that Dr. Risling-Baldy is thinking of this, it really explicitly draws on Indigenous philosophies as living entities. They're not archaic, they're not anachronistic, they exist to this day. Indigenous communities continue to think with and philosophize with our stories. The non-human beings who populate and people those stories continue to be really important theorists that inform how we do things. And so this work also very explicitly positions fish as non-human persons or more than human persons with political agency in their own right. So fish as kin, fish as relations, fish as agents who are capable of negotiating complex circumstances, and a lot of different Indigenous cosmologies and societies throughout what is currently known as North America have so many different fish stories that are really important to help all of us understand how we can come into better relation with water, with fish, with other aquatic species, in this time of such heavy environmental destruction throughout the US and Canada. So also drawing on the work of Val Napoleon, who's an incredible Indigenous legal scholar at the University of Victoria, she's written extensively about Indigenous legal orders, which she differentiates from legal systems. So legal orders are she would describe them as like the reasoned processes that Indigenous peoples have used since time immemorial to navigate the messiness of being human. So these are norms and responsibilities that help guide people's collective actions in Indigenous contexts. She's explicitly writing from the perspective of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but through conversations with our partners outside of Canada, it's very clear that there are aspects of this that can travel. But it's important. I always tell this to my students, and I try to make it explicit in other aspects of my work. When I'm speaking from an Indigenous perspective in what is currently claimed as Canada, I'm not making the case that this stands in for all Indigenous experiences. Very clearly, I'm a Métis person from the Red River. We have my family has explicit historical relations to the Red River, the Assiniboine, all through the Saskatchewan River system, into Alberta through the North Saskatchewan. And so I'm speaking from a particular place, and I would never want to generalize that or homogenize that over other Indigenous people's experiences. But there's power in the plurality of Indigenous concepts, Indigenous principles, Indigenous approaches to things. So Belle Napoleon, when she talks about Indigenous legal orders as these reasoned processes through which Indigenous peoples govern our communities, she talks about the central aspect of stories in governing. And so she talks about stories as legal realities in their own right. And so stories, Louis Bird, who is a Cree knowledge keeper and author and incredible philosopher that Val also draws on, he says, that stories are good to think with. And so, and this is sort of a concept that gets repeated in lots of different contexts where, stories, it's nice to listen to them. They can be entertaining, but also stories are rigorous tools to understand the world. And so when we're talking about restoring fish habitats, restoring relationships to fish through stories, restoring those relations, we're thinking of stories as these powerful tools that are innovative, they're adaptive, they're alive, they're not static, and that they're how people make sense of the world. So stories are more than just myths, and this is a point that Kutcha Rising-Baldy makes in her work as well. Indigenous stories aren't myths. When people say like Sky Woman, as Vanessa Watts says in her own work, she says like, when I talk about Sky Woman or First Woman, these are people who really lived and they had, real lives on this planet, and they are theorists in their own right, and I draw upon them in that sense. So Vanessa Watts is another really awesome person to check out. She has a really foundational piece called Indigenous Place Thought that was published in 2013, and it's a really powerful text to check out. And then finally, the person that really informs our fish restoring work is Blackfoot knowledge keeper, philosopher, scholar, Leroy Littlebear, who in various talks has pointed out that we need to ask the fish what they think. And he makes the point that fish have survived multiple mass extinctions. And so fish have their own scientific formula and that we should ask them. And so you can imagine taking this approach can be a little bit daunting in a Western colonial capitalist, white supremacist academic paradigm, because we sort of explicitly say in our grants we're going to ask the fish what they think, and sometimes that works out for us, and sometimes we get reviews back saying like, you have to clarify what you mean by this, but we mean very explicitly that fish are people. And they're not specimens of study. They're not to be experimented on. They are people that we think with and alongside. And so our fish restoring methodology also is very explicitly a non-physically invasive approach. So there's important scientific work that's being done, to study, selenium levels and different pollutants accumulating in fish bodies. And, we completely understand that work has import, but that because we are working from Indigenous perspectives with specific responsibilities to fish as relations, as kin, we strive very hard to do non-invasive work with them. So that can mean, using slightly different methods that don't physically interfere with fish autonomy. So this is sort of the approach we're taking, and hopefully it's making sense, but I'll draw it out a little bit more so that you can kind of understand where we're coming from. So I'll head to the next slide. So part of what's also, motivating our work is that, it's become really clear in recent years that Indigenous peoples are at the sort of forefront of environmental protection globally. And so the UN has repeatedly asserted that Indigenous peoples represent 5% of the Earth's population, but protect 80% of its biodiversity. So, that's a huge that's a huge responsibility for a relatively small number of people, communities to sort of take on. And so further, Richard Schuster and others argued in 2019, after they looked at data on vertebrate biodiversity in government and Indigenous managed lands in Canada, Australia, and Brazil. And they found that Indigenous managed lands were as effective, and in some cases even more effective than state protections. So like things like national parks. And so putting these two things together, as I often do in my teaching in my classes, I sort of ask, why do you think this is? Why is it that 5% of the Earth's population, Indigenous people, are protecting 80% of its biodiversity? And in turn, this empirical data that shows that that's actually the case in terms of these case studies that they looked at in Australia, Brazil, and Canada, what's going on there? And so the answer that our team can offer is that Indigenous legal orders are really crucial to this, that communities that are governing through Indigenous cosmologies, and by cosmology, I mean an Indigenous sort of worlding that is founded on, specific reciprocal relations to different human and more than human beings through time and space. That these specific relationships that often work differently than capitalist extractive models and domination-based understandings of controlling the natural world lend themselves really well to protecting ecosystems, watersheds, and other habitats. This isn't without its challenges, though, as we also know that Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous and other marginalized, land defenders globally are at significant risk of violence for this work. And so we've seen every year, Indigenous land defenders being murdered for the work that they're doing. So this isn't sort of some romantic kind of, concept of like, that sort of new age interpretation of indigeneity that sort of, deracinates it or sort of homogenizes it and sort of sells it as, kind of offensive appropriations of Indigenous knowledge, but it's very explicit and at times dangerous work protecting specific places. But when we're working with the concept of indigeneity in our own work, we mean it in an expansive sense. So we mean it in a sense that understands diasporic peoples in the Americas as Indigenous, so people who have specific knowledges that their ancestors carried with them when they were brought here through violent historic violent historic processes like the Middle Passage. So we want to be as like careful and thoughtful and expansive in our understanding of indigeneity as possible. So there is a conflict that's kind of really apparent between sort of a white anthropological understanding of indigeneity, which has, and Audra Simpson has really challenged this in her book Mohawk Interruptus, where there's sort of the white anthropologist studying Indigenous people, which is about really like, it really comes from that spirit of like, really collecting people and almost placing them like butterflies on a sort of static medium and saying like, yes, I've studied their ceremonies, I've studied their language, I've done the kinship charts, this is what this group is. And what we argue for in our own work is a more like pluralistic understanding of indigeneity that acknowledges like historic injustices and forced removals of people, the fact that Canadian and American empire and British Empire, French, German, Dutch, that those violences forced peoples perhaps away from their homelands, but didn't disrupt those ongoing stories that people carry. And so I guess I'm just trying to make the case here that we're not looking for an exclusive argument of indigeneity, but one that is explicitly, anti-white supremacist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, and that really focuses in on these incredible pluralities of Indigenous knowing that inform that environmental protection work. So I would say that this work emphasizes social relations and societies that emphasize social relations that center lands, waters, atmospheres and the responsibilities therein. So I have a really brilliant student, Alika. I hope it's okay that I quote her here. She made the point in class the other day that, the challenge with the human rights framework is that it's oppositional to an Indigenous worldview, which is a responsibility-based framework, which is one that really centers like, I am in the world, how do I continue to make this world habitable for myself, for my loved ones, and for other people, whether they're human or more than human. So I hope this is making sense. So in our own work, we say that we're honoring Indigenous laws, science, and environmental knowledge. We're explicitly interdisciplinary. We're not interested in the policing of disciplinary boundaries. So we use science, but we also use art. We use legal cases. We use anything that can kind of help us advocate for the fish. So someone once said, when I was asked what my methodology was, and I couldn't really answer because I just felt that my work was maybe not fitting into academic approaches. And so someone said, well, your methodology is you follow the fish. And so I've taken that to heart and sort of how we're framing our work. And so then again, coming back to the restoring methodology, we're really trying to sort of show that everyone has a fish story, whether it's that you don't get to catch fish like you used to when you were younger, or you can't eat fish because you're allergic, that's okay. But really, reframing that relationship to fish so that it's not that only scientists can be the experts on fish, but actually we're all experts on our own experiences. We're experts of the specific relationships we have to place, and to really encourage sort of like what is it that Audra Simpson called it, like an epistemic promiscuity in how we approach these kind of efforts to save or work with and be better relations with non-human species. And then we're explicitly focused on fish futures. So we're really thinking about what does it take? Fish have survived, as Leroy Littlebear points out, fish have survived multiple mass extinctions. And this morning I woke up and for some reason, the word KT boundary kept reverberating over and over in my head. And I don't know why I was dreaming about the KT boundary and the last mass extinction event. But fish, as Leroy Littlebear argues, have survived multiple mass extinctions. They've been on the planet for roughly 500 million years. But in North America, they've barely survived several hundred years of white supremacist, colonial capitalist violence. And so that's really important, that white supremacist colonial violence is as world ending as a comet or a meteor, a meteor. And so thinking through how do we build relations that can kind of disrupt that level of violence. And so again, we come back to stories. Everybody has a fish story, and it's so incredible. I was in a workshop recently and I sort of talked about this project, and then, many of the participants just wanted to share their fish stories about, what's happening to the fish in their own communities. And it was really powerful, precisely because that's exactly what we're hoping we can foster with this project and this ongoing work. So our current, official project is called Plural Perspectives on Bighorn Country, Restoring Land Use Governance and Bull Trout Population Health in Alberta. And I said I would come back to the trout and how everybody has a trout story. So, and this may be relevant to West Virginia. Alberta is in the process. We weren't satisfied with only being a massive oil and gas economy. Our current government has decided that they're going to open up previously protected lands in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains that used to be called Category 2 lands. And they've opened them up, they tried to open them up to massive mountaintop removal, coal mining for metallurgical coal by Australian companies who sort of run out of chances in Australia. They've been, they've done a lot of damage in Indigenous lands in Australia, but not content with destroying one continent. They're happy to come and invest in Alberta. And it's complicated, with the crash of the oil economy, sort of post 2014, Alberta has fallen on hard times, and it hasn't known hard times since 1947 when it first struck oil at Leduc number 1 and became a have province for several generations. And it's been hard for Alberta to sort of adjust after knowing the level of sort of wealth that is had since 1947. So, I'm not here to sort of say that, I don't blame people who are pursuing coal mining as a possible, remedy to the economic challenges of the province. But, the 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 lands that they're trying to open up are Indigenous lands. They're Blackfoot, Stoney, Nakota, and other First Nation lands that are stolen lands. These are not lands that the government has a right to just sort of unilaterally open up. And in fact, it was a conservative government in the 1970s who consulted Albertans on whether there should be open pit coal mining in these areas, and Albertans resoundingly said no. And so they actually developed the 1976 coal development policy that categorized those lands as sort of untouchable for this kind of resource extraction. But the current government withdrew those protections on a Friday. They announced it on a Friday of a May-long weekend last spring during sort of the first surge of the pandemic. So, you can really stand behind a policy decision when you take a move like that, a Friday. Everybody who's worked in PR knows that you advertise the most unpopular things on a Friday because it won't get into the news cycle. And so what was incredible, and this is where the trout come back, what was incredible was that this region, it's full of recreational land use areas. There's plenty of ranchers and other collective land use stakeholders, and it was really interesting to see that how the pushback came was through ranchers, through Indigenous community leaders, and also through country music stars, which may not be your first go-to as leading the revolution in Alberta, which is one of the most conservative provinces in Canada. But it was Corblund, who's a really awesome alt country musician who educated himself on what was going on with this and spoke out. And that got a lot of traction. And of course, there were environmental NGOs and other groups have been working on this for a long time. But that sort of spark, that story, the restoring that needs to happen, Corblund really understood that. And so he used his various platforms on Instagram and Twitter to sort of talk about what was at stake here with sort of selenium poisoning of the watershed, the impacts it could have on cattle grazing, how ranchers were going to be losing their grazing lands and have no recourse because resource extractive activities take precedent. And so that started. And then what I found super fascinating was that his friend and fellow musician, Paul Brandt, who's a very popular Alberta musician, he rewrote a popular song called Alberta Bound, and it became sort of like an Alberta anthem. I listened to it as we drove across the country last year so that I could come home after having COVID for 7 months. And I moved after I definitely didn't have COVID anymore, and doctors said it was okay, and we took lots of precautions. But Paul Brandt, he waded in and waded. You'll see the pun I'm using there. He waded into the conversation by posting a picture of him fly fishing for trout in the eastern slopes. So waders wading. And that further sort of boosted this. And a lot of the public outcry from non-Indigenous Albertans revolved around the loss of fly fishing opportunities. And this is a region where my stepdad spent most of his lifetime, fly fishing, but also studying and understanding what was going on in that region. It's where I learned how to fly fish. And so, yeah, the power of relationships to fish, I think, shouldn't be understated. That in a time of such massive environmental upheaval that is purely caused by white supremacy and colonial capitalism and imperialism, that fish really captivate people. Fish are fascinating. We descend from fish. They are our ancestors. They are our co-travelers. They've been present at times when, we've needed them. When I worked in the Northwest Territories in an Inuvialuit community, learning from fishermen in the community, there was an elder that I spent quite a bit of time with named Annie Alisiak, and the lesson she told me over and over again through my doctoral studies was you never go hungry in the land if you have fish, which was, really this sort of significant teaching that, if caribou or other land-based species collapse because of the various, um, challenges that Arctic communities are facing, the one thing that, she knew through her lifetime was that you always had fish. There was always fish. And what is sort of terrifying is that we're reaching a point where there might not be fish. And so what do we do? How do we address that? And so we're arguing in our work that requires a reorientation to fish, and that we can learn a lot from Indigenous and other non-Western, non-dominant communities who have these really deep storied relationships to fish. So I think I'll end there. I hope I've left time for questions. But I'll just show you. So when I talk about being Métis, my friend Darren O'Toole, when this like newly like highly detailed map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed was released in 2016, he pointed it out to me and he said, isn't it interesting that almost perfectly maps where most of the Red River Métis sort of political history took place through the 1800s. And so, when I think about my responsibilities, they're right there as an Indigenous person. I also have a settler ancestry through my mom, and my dad's family is mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But, that right there, those watersheds that make up the Lake Winnipeg watershed really encapsulate who we are. But they also encapsulate new relationships. And so I also just want to sort of end on the point that, again, with our concept of indigeneity being expansive, I personally think it's really important for Indigenous scholars, activists, and others to sort of maybe provincialize the presence that white settler scholars place themselves in these recovery and conservation efforts. And we should really be talking to other communities, so like Black communities, refugee communities, other communities who've been impacted by colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, and that the sort of solidarity that can be built through sort of fish stories is really present there as well. And so thinking about my dad growing up in Edmonton as an urban Métis kid, the people that he went fishing with were actually immigrant families who ran lines for suckers through the North Saskatchewan. And so, the sort of solidarity relationships are really important. And so I hope that I'm explaining that as eloquently as I'm trying to, which is just that I think like provincializing white science, settler science, and really looking to how have other communities been sustained by these sort of relationships to water and fish, and what can we learn from one another? And that's partially also why our project is international, because we're working with communities that are impacted by fish declines in Australia, in the Pacific, in Borneo, and also through Canada and the US. So we really want to build that capacity, sort of decenter the sort of like prominence of sort of white people saying like, here, we have the answers for how to save the fish. It's like, clearly you don't, because it's your systems of government and knowledge that have coincided directly with the rapid destruction of fish as kin throughout all these watersheds. So I just want to say thank you. Anytime I get to talk about fish, I'm always really delighted. And so I'll just finish with, I know I've said I'm going to finish 3 times now, and so really finish a personal project I've taken on in relation to our work is I'm trying to draw every single native or naturalized fish species in Alberta, and inviting other people to join in, because a great way to learn about the fish is to draw them. And it's a non-invasive way to kind of learn more about them and celebrate them and restory them and encourage others to join in. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, all errors are mine. And as I say with all my work, I'm not here to tell other people how to do things. I'm just hoping that I can share insight that may be useful to you. So take what's useful, leave what isn't. And thank you for the time to share.